Now I don't know. I don't know what you guys have taken from what I've just said, but the episode of Unlicensed Psychology episodes happen in two parts. The first is where I say stuff. The second is where you say stuff, and hopefully I have something to say in response. Maybe there's a give and take. So obviously I haven't gotten good at transitioning into the second stage of the process. But let's try to start a dialogue. And then we'll like roll credits when when the camera runs out of power. Or we just get bored.
Not bored.
Yeah. Okay, so that last part was, I probably should have tried to woven it into the whole thing, and then I wouldn't have had to transition into, that sort of just reading it flat out mode. And also, there was a person, one of the people I sent the video to, she said, maybe you should try to shorten it, because all the TED Talks, they're only 18 to 20 minutes because they've done studies that show that's the only length. But I have, and that's an important point, and maybe it's important to try to shorten things. However, I dragged you guys out here, and this is not just on the internet. This is a live thing with actual people, which is the only reason I have the motivation to do it. So I think that gives us an excuse to stretch it on a little further, not make it just a short little TED Talk.
So you're turning it over to questions now?
Yes.
Questions.
Yeah, begin. I mean, I would sit down, but I don't want the camera to have nothing entertaining going on. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's questions that can be answered, or comments that can be made. And if you don't want to speak them loud, I'll repeat them so that the camera can hear them, or I guess how about I do my bow and then we do some questions. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'll now. Okay. Okay. Also, this new relaxed kind of mode, I want it to be somewhat relaxed, because I don't want the awkwardness of the camera to ruin what might be an actually cool dialogue. So so that's why I'm just talking off the cuff. Might not play well. But yeah, so that's the masculine principle. That's how you divide God up and talk about one thing. The next week's lecture, or next week's lecture, so I take on the feminine principle, and hopefully I do better than Don Quixote with that. But I've also spent a lot of time on the feminine principle too, so I think I can take a fair stab at it. Hey Ed, any questions? Yeah, I know you came a little
I apologize.
late, but it's cool. This is Ed.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. I'm sorry that I was late.
That's okay. We worked together.
Yeah, good. I watched the first YouTube, but it's very nice to be here in person. I was actually going to ask if you would like to sit down at this stage.
Maybe let's do let's take on the role of a director, a film director, somebody with a taste for cinematics and a sense of
well.
Yeah, let's okay.
Tripod, we get lower.
Okay, so does anybody have any problems with being on camera or something? Or I mean, I don't personally. Chris did.
But it seems like you could still sit like there or something, and then we don't have to be on camera.
Oh, okay. Is that cool?
Just put it at you.
Okay.
Yeah, you can like put it in the corner.
Just maybe. It's pretty cool. That's pretty good. That won't have anything. I'm gonna have to.
Then you can have a seat and relax while we continue our discussion.
Okay. Does anyone want to check the cinematography for excellence?
Absolutely.
I want to see if they get the shoes.
Oh, you want the shoes?
Because my shoelaces are like. I think the world should know that I
And the world should know.
have multiple shoelaces.
The camera saw your shoelaces, but if they want to see your head, they can't stare at them. Remainder.
Isn't it
You can't
interesting?
show the shoelaces and the head.
Okay. It's interesting. I always thought the camera is like an invasive quality,
Mm-hmm.
but that's like the camera is very feminine in that it captures absolutely everything that occurs. It doesn't miss anything.
It misses everything that's outside of the frame.
Right, but it does. It sure gets a lot more than. But it's masculine in that it's like an intrusive sword, cut into this moment.
So this is a good question. What is the point of defining things, like putting things into a box as masculine and feminine? Like, I just don't really...
Yeah, well...
Why
So
tell me why it helps us. Like, tell me why it helps us as a society to put things into masculine and feminine boxes. Especially when our society has thus far, and still continues, to completely denigrate the feminine and everything associated with it.
It does that less so than it used to.
But it's still alive and well.
It's only brief.
And
It's been like, what,
insidious.
100 years?
Yeah,
Well,
It
absolutely.
could very well
like,
swing
yeah.
back the other way.
so you just tell me why it
Okay.
helps, and I will listen. But I'm
Oh yeah.
very doubtful.
Well, there's a couple questions, which is, one is like, if you were to divide, if you define God as like everything that exists, God is the sum total of all reality, bar nothing. Then, and your goal is to like have a finite number of lectures which follow God. Then my thing was, okay, I'll just divide God, and one of the most traditional ways to do it was to use the masculine and feminine divide, but there's like a whole bunch of other ways in theory you could do it. One way is it makes a more interesting lecture to divide existence into a masculine and feminine component. It's much more tantalizing to listen to that than it would be to say like, I'm just going to say the hard and the soft, or I'm going to say like, I don't know, like matter and energy. Like if I divided it into matter and energy, then okay, I'm just going to be talking about physics the whole time, but it won't bring it down to a personal level. So there's something about just making something interesting. Because like this show happens, I'm calling them episodes, like I'm calling them lectures but also episodes, and part of the episodes is like, it's supposed to be entertaining and interesting. And you might say I'm like really crucifying people on the cross of masculinity and femininity when they should be taken off that cross and allowed to be who they really are without being imposed that kind of thought process. I think that women were very much historically devalued, mostly because it was necessary, because they could die in childbirth. They couldn't. Biology itself restricted what women could do, and so it sort of like men were the ones who had the freedom, and I think that's like I don't know. Ultimately, I think what you're asking is like how much of this is sort of cultural and how much of this is sort of.
No, I'm asking.
Is there anything?
I'm asking like,
Yeah.
do you believe in patriarchy, and does this come into play at all? Because it seems like.
Well,
seems
sort
like
of.
You
I mean,
just think that patriarchy doesn't really exist, and you're like talking outside of it. and it doesn't really
I
make
don't
sense
know.
to
I
me.
mean, patriarchy literally would be the rule by men, rule by the fathers.
Which is
No, it
literally
actually-
how the world has been
It's-
for very long time.
It's just the
Yeah.
valuing of masculine over feminine. Like the valuing of things that are associated with men over women.
Yeah. One of the difficulties with this lecture is there are so many angles. Like you bring up one thing, and there's so many angles that you can start approaching the topic with. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is like, what if you were trying to define some principle like yang that was you're on camera.
Oh, camera.
This is what happens when you're a traveling lecturer. You take the accommodations which can be afforded to you, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So if you want to host it, don't worry about it. I'm all game with that. I think there's a lot of value. Suppose you found two principles in which you could divine the universe, and you had no intention of calling them masculine or feminine, and then you decided to. Like my approach was like the masculine is the thing that tears things apart and separates them, and the feminine is the one that pulls them together. And you could do like a completely analytical approach to the universe. That but you don't call either one masculine and feminine. You just have like your own terms like yin or yang, and you don't say one is male and one's female. That's really hard to do. I mean, separating and pulling together is like one of the only ways you could analyze the universe. Like the one that separates is masculine, and so like even the Tao symbol, which is like the masculine and the yin and the yang, they're separated, and so to some extent separating is like a necessary thing. Like when we're all in the womb, right? There's no separation at all, and when we have consciousness, all of a sudden like we're separate from the world. We're a separate thing, and a lot of sort of suffering comes in with that. But the whole idea of separation is critical to most things, the existence of most things. And that, I don't know, it's just that if I were just to stick with just separation and unity, it would be a really dry talk. I wouldn't be able to like say, like you can't talk about Don Quixote, like that's a great story, and it really reflects the attitude of men.
Maybe it's more like the way I'm trying to understand your talk is you're talking about feminine and masculine archetypes, and the things you attribute to a feminine and masculine archetype are different than what you would apply to individual human beings who happen to be masculine or happen to be feminine.
Yeah.
So you're really using this just as an archetype to define these concepts you're talking about.
Yeah.
You're not really talking about real men, real women. You're talking about it as the concept of masculinity, the concept of femininity, which none of us actually fit into that completely.
Yeah, no one fits into it completely, but for example, if you take the masculine thing, it's like we got these are the real categories, and they really exist, and they matter, and they affect the world, and if you pretend that they don't exist, then you're doing a disservice to somebody. And so that's like the masculine way of looking at it. It's like to divide things into categories. And I would just point out that what you're saying is like the feminine way of looking at it is like these categories, they're fuzzy, the borders aren't really real. Why would you divide things into masculine and feminine when there's really no way to make these distinctions? And so my personal, and here's the thing.
I don't think that's what she was saying, though.
Well, that's what I've commonly encountered. People say, well, everybody's different, everybody's unique, like nobody's partaking. You can sort of like, it's sort of like men, I've noticed that men do focus on the masculine principle in an extreme way. I had an example, which is like the Roman Catholic Church. It's like a completely masculine institution. Like in the about the 1100s or something, they decided we're going to be all celibate men. So they have a pyramid and a bunch of men, none of whom are allowed to have sex with anything. and no, like, I just don't see women doing that. I don't see women having this idea that the guy at the top is the guy at the top. He's the Pope. He is the Bishop of Rome who is infallible. Like, I just don't, I honestly do see differences in the way men and women act. And they do, to some extent, or even to a large extent, apply to different ways of approaching the world and thinking about things. You know?
Yeah, it's interesting, if I may. I think at the end of your talk, you asked openly, I think, as thinking out loud, whether these symbols that you were exploring, for example, categories of male and female being a part of this symbolic network, whether they're real, whether there's actually a substantial reality to them or not. And I think that's the question that's being begged. I don't see, as you do, any of these descriptions of masculine and feminine essence or symbolism. It just sounds to me like cultural and historical constructions, and so if, for example, we have to look at the history of the Catholic Church in the 12th century, in order to explore what the category is, or what a man is like, or why celibacy, for example, is a male character rather than a female character.
Well, just self-imposed celibacy on an entire hierarchy of people.
Well, wait a minute. Two things: celibacy and hierarchy. Why do they go together?
I think there is a masculine psychology at work in the Catholic Church. And I like the example because who would impose celibacy on themselves? Like, you must be getting something in return for that. And arguably you would say they became a very powerful institution and very influential because they were seen as avoiding nepotism. You don't pass on your hierarchy to your own child. So they did acquire a huge amount of power as a result of becoming celibate. But they continue to be celibate. Like, it's like they're striving for something that I don't think women would strive for. They're striving for some kind of perfection.
Depends on the woman.
Some kind of removing yourself from the world and not even being part of the world. And and that's like what this Christian ideal is. The best person is the one who has no interaction with the world at all and is completely celibate and completely is like removed. It's like, to me, that's a kind of striving that I don't normally think women, it just doesn't strike me as something women would do. So, like, I do see differences in the way actual men and women, manifest. And so the question is that enough to make these cosmic categories? Is the actual differences in the way men and women manifest on Earth, or males and females, generally speaking, of all species? You got your like peacocks, and your hens and things like that.
Zach, you said that you were trying to bring a masculine attitude to the world.
At times, yeah.
Can I ask why?
Well, I mean, I think all men either do it, they often do it consciously or unconsciously. One of these issues is like, well, if it's happening consciously or unconsciously, then it's like, oh yeah, okay.
So I would argue that I know some men that don't bring a masculine attitude to the world. I mean, I suppose it depends on your definition of what a man is. But
yeah,
I know some people that consciously or unconsciously bring what some might consider a feminine attitude or a neutral attitude to the world. So you personally, I guess, is my question.
Well, it's just normal. Like, for me, it's just I'm like Don Quixote, or at least I am until I acknowledge that condition that I have and try to say, okay, how can I be in the world like this? Because Don Quixote, he's so needing to find the enemy to do valiant battle with that he acquires all of these illusions. And I totally identify with that. I mean, I think that is the way many, many men are. It's like they just want to know who the bad guy is so that they can go and fight him.
It's kind of interesting. You actually are bringing a masculine principle to it in the act of we have masculine and we have feminine.
Yeah, the act of dividing and any attempt to separate something and talk about, distinguish the categories, at least according to this idea, is masculine. It doesn't necessarily have to be, in theory it could be feminine, but it traditionally is masculine. And it's somewhat consistent with how men want categories and they want hierarchies, they want to know where their rank is.
You said that said you were finding a way to identify with, like you identify with Don Quixote. So masculine attitudes is something that you identify with, and it helps you connect to these larger themes. So is there a possibility that when we split God as this larger idea into a masculine and a feminine, then we lose the possibility of identifying with a whole God, and we find ourselves only identifying with the half that we think?
Well, it's let's say you have a label, like let's say you have some disease, like you have diabetes, and there's a bunch of symptoms that are associated with that, and then nobody knows that, nobody has a name for it. Then you just have all those symptoms, and you don't have any coherent narrative which tells you like what the disease is. And so a lot of times you get benefited by having a label. So if I feel a conglomeration of feelings about who I am and what I'm doing here, if I have a name for it, I can say, oh, I am that. That's who I am. I can see that I fit into that archetype.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking that if I, as a female-born person, only identify with the feminine half of God, then am I missing out on the possibility of all of these other traits that we've chosen to label as masculine? Is there another possibility of finding a way to identify with a whole God or a whole person?
Yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing about that is in Jungian psychology, he has a sort of technical, laid-out solution for that situation, which is that the Latin word for spirit is animus, and for soul is anima. And Jung has, males typically have an anima, which is their soul, and it's always female. And it always is like a princess, or it's like some divine woman who is like, might come to them in their dreams, or something like that. And women have like white knights, or something, maybe like a pretty primitive version of the animus is a white knight. It's sort of like a childish version, but then as they evolve, they might have different versions of the animus. So that's how Jung divides it. And I think you get I get a lot of mileage from Jung's approach, which is that, and just the same way the Tao, those dots, there's those little dots. That's saying that the masculine always has a component of the feminine, and the feminine always has a component of the masculine. So you get the division and the opportunity to develop your other side. So I'm pretty happy about that, personally. So that's what I would say. It's like the inner masculine spirit of a woman is called the animus, and and Jung will also, Jung talks about all these dreams. It's like most people don't talk about dreams like at all, and let alone as a technical subject for scientific analysis. But for Jung, it's like a man has, like I had a woman appear to me in my dream. I was in a 7-layer city, and I don't know if you guys know, it's on my blog. I type it up, and she appears in my dream saying she has my baby. That's like so hardcore anima. That's so hardcore Jungian right there. And it's like, maybe it's like it happens to you in your dream, and you literally have experienced it. That's why I take Jung so seriously. It's like maybe you wouldn't take stuff like that seriously if you didn't have these like really powerful dreams that like told you, no, this is real. This is a real thing. This isn't just something floating out that is optional. No, not for me anyway. You know, was that you know what I mean? Like, was that anywhere near what you? Yeah. So young, you know, you got the door open, so you can develop your own,
I think it's,
you know, masculine side, so to say. That's sort of like the way the narrative goes. And Jung didn't exist in a time when all the genders were all mixed and matched, and gay liberation, and you know, hybrid people, and like Jung always had a really, he just, you know, relied on the traditions of his time, which are the masculine and the feminine. You know, just men and women. He didn't like do much about homosexuals or anything like that. But you could extend it to just say, it's, in other words, so I'm a man, so I'm like 75% partaking of the masculine principle and 25% partaking of the feminine principle, and the average woman will partake 75% of the feminine principle and 25% of the masculine principle.
I guess that's the next question then. So in this culture today where lots of people are talking about how the masculine and the feminine don't need to be continued, and we would do well to leave those behind and move on to thinking of ourselves as people, and gender is just can be much more flexible. So in the context of those ideas, what is the mileage that we get from looking at God in these two very separate
Making
worlds?
separations. I guess it would go straight to the thing about having a label to identify with, which is often extremely helpful for people. Like, they removed Asperger's syndrome from the new DSM manual, and like, that was really stupid, because even if Asperger's is just an autism spectrum, there's still like all these people who identify with Asperger's and really love to, that's how they found their community, is by saying I'm Asperger's. And so names, it's just the power of giving names to things. And so if you say, yeah, let's get rid of male, female, let's not have them anymore. Okay, fine, you've gotten rid of all like whatever cruelty and injustice has occurred, but you also have no names anymore. So it's like you could rewind really far, and you could have a situation where a man is, like, for example, a woman wanted to get her little boy, he's like a toddler, she wanted to like teach him that there's no difference, and so he had Barbies, and then he pulls the leg off the Barbie and starts swinging it around like a sword. Like, and that's really common. You know, that's what boys usually do. Not all, but that's typically what they're going to do. Like, and so names for things can be helpful. The idea that that's somehow demonstrating masculinity, I think we should keep that. I think we should do a little more actual intellectual work to figure out what's really going on, instead of just throwing everything away in that feminine way of uniting everything and pulling it all back together and saying everything's the same, you know?
That's a question that begs itself for me.
Okay.
That the example of the doll aside, despite that, that intrinsically the male principle is a principle that pulls apart, and the female principle one that pulls together. It's not self-evident to me that there's any reality in that distinction.
Well, then the way you would test that, you would say, well, who is it? Let's say we dissolve the categories altogether. There's no more men and no more women. If it turns out men are sitting in their rooms all day playing video games, having no identity, and women are graduating at higher and higher rates, going to college, getting all the jobs men used to do, and men are like really poorly adapted in that world where men and women don't exist anymore. But if you actually take the people and you see what is the outcome, then I would argue that the dissolving of those categories has led to the advantage of women. It has promoted women and made women get ahead. By not acknowledging categories, it enters into a female realm where you don't need specific words and specific categories. And the way you would test it would be you would see whether women are getting ahead or not in that actual world.
You know, I mean, women are doing things that guys used to do.
Yeah, better than they used to do them.
Yeah, so I
Sometimes.
mean, but the distinctions are false. So I mean, I don't, you know.
I'm just saying the way you would test it empirically, and you would say, let's just dissolve the categories and see what happens to the people in question.
A narrative example. A family, and it's only narrative. It's historical narrative, but it's narrative that a family is under attack, and the woman who is protecting her children divides her family apart and places each child as far away from the other as possible in order to assure as much as possible the preservation of some of her offspring. She does this, you know, intuitively. She just does it. She's separating things. She's not bringing them together. I mean, that is that descriptive category of a male principle tearing apart, female principle pulling together, unless there's a logicality in this that I'm missing. You know,
I don't know.
It just seems like a narrative description, a narrative. You know, I don't see it as distinct.
But you can have a universe in which things are being pulled apart and being put together all the time, and there's no men and women. This is before any life shows up whatsoever. There's no sexual reproduction. You know.
It's happening.
Yeah, but you'd still have that separation pulling together, and you wouldn't call it masculine and women. So the controversy is saying, okay, what does that have to do with men? What is like dividing things up?
That's kind of what I was saying. I was saying that what you're describing is not so much men and women as is these archetypes and their constructions, things you create to describe, you know.
Yeah, and then this question is, what do you call that? What do you call that archetype?
Right.
And I guess I'm just calling it masculine, partly because, first of all, I thought it was more interesting to do that. But second, because I think men are on the out and out. Like, men are we're obsolete to some extent.
I think there's just a funny thing that's happening now that women have, you know, are starting to begin to have the power that they should have in society. I think there's always a reactionary backlash that's going to happen when huge changes happen in society. It's like, oh, the end of men.
But then if you look at who's in political office,
I know, men are still in charge.
See, like,
don't worry.
1% of women in political office.
No, but that's like what zombie.
And then all men are like, oh my god, women are coming. It's like, there are no women in political office. None.
Yeah, no.
There's like, and so for you to say
they're
that,
breaking,
like,
they're breaking down all the
this...
barricades slowly
Okay, and then
but
also,
surely.
let's look at like the amount of sexual assault that is still happening and the reaction of men to that. People saying like,
So
well, women should have
like...
to take responsibility. You know, like, there's just so many examples that you can look at, not just in America, but in like all over the world, of how like patriarchy is still alive and well. And
it's only Western society that this end of men thing is even happening in. So we're kind of in the minority on this planet
it's
anyway.
probably going to change in other cultures too.
But it's also like, I think just the perception of like the end of men. It's like, it does to me just seem kind of like a reactionary thing against women making tiny strides forward. Like,
they're not making tiny strides forward.
It's like the backlash of feminism. That's kind of what I'm
No, it's
perceiving.
not. I mean, you know, like, I don't think so. Like, there's two things you can do. One is you can say, there may or may not be real points being made here. And the other is you can say, we know for sure there's no real points being made here. You know, like...
I do have to say, I really, really enjoy the talk when I take it outside the concept of actual masculinity and femininity. When I think about the principles you were describing in the universe and that and the whole thing, it is amazing. But if I relate it to myself as a woman or a man or specific, then I get messed up. But on the whole, the talking about these two concepts is really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of funny that according to what I'm saying, the feminine idea is to merge things and to not say you're you and you're you, like this is black and this is white. It's to make it more gray, to like murk the borders. And that is, I'm saying that's feminine, but I guess I'm also kind of saying like, that's why women are getting ahead in the world, is because the borders are so murked up. We don't know like who the bad guy is, and therefore, like education with regard to sexual assault, obviously, that's sort of one I can't, this division I'm making can't address that but the one thing men do fall into a hierarchy. Like if a man comes and beats up another man, there's a certain kind of like, I don't know, I certainly grew up thinking that was more or less the natural order of things, that like, some guys get the girls or whatever and some guys don't, and that you get beat up on the playground. It's just like men like beat each other up, I guess. I don't know. Or at least, yeah.
It's interesting. Women beat each other up too. And
psychologically.
Well, and I've
oh my
seen,
God, that's the thing. As a
yeah.
child, I was always beating people up. That was crazy.
I think rather than masculine and feminine, like the biblical narrative is really one of conquest and violence, and I think the question of categorization and distinction comes along with domination and conquest, and so the biblical narrative also vacillates between a female God and a male God, and there's kind of an undercurrent, of conflict throughout the biblical narrative and various assertions of that conflict, and in the end, the male principle wins out, except for certain exceptional periods of time. But that's because the history of recorded history is all about conquest. And I think more than male or female, I think it's more about a certain aspect of a male's biology that predominates at times of violence, and I say an aspect of male individuality, because I think the real archetypal questions are questions of domination and violence, unfortunately, and I think that's when male separation and male dominance becomes more distinct.
Yeah, I mean.
I feel like I'm losing ground myself.
It's fine, yeah, no, because like I don't come at it with the idea that it's about conquest and domination. Like I'm not saying there isn't conquest and domination, but like my worldview doesn't make them like the central thing, even though they do exist. So I don't have any conflict because I didn't start from the proposition that there's conquest and domination as the narrative. So I don't know what the conflicts would be if that was where I was starting from. You know what I mean?
My very simple notion about history is that women dominated until men invented tools. And then, then tools and weapons took over. And
but even when women dominate, there's still There's still problems.
That is to say,
There's still going to be problems, though.
I'm not saying otherwise. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm not saying there weren't small conflicts, tribal conflicts. I'm not saying there wasn't violence. I wasn't saying there weren't.
Yeah. Well, my take on most of prehistoric culture was that men were fighting other men for women and territory and spoils. Like, I think that war is almost like one of our basic programs. You know?
Mm-hmm.
That's how I looked at it. Like, because people always say, oh, it was a pristine time of hunting and gathering. Well, yeah, it would be if there wasn't a tribe right next to right on the other side there who also wants the pristine hunting and gathering.
I'm not trying to idealize anything. I just I'm also struck by the cultural richness of all this archetypal talk.
Yeah.
But beyond the warmth and the cultural richness of it, I think if we're trying to converse about who we are now, we have to give up, our enthrallment with past culture, and see where we are now. We're not without war. We're not without violence.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this, suppose I decided that the Chinese words yin and yang were better names for the principles that I'm trying to talk about. I guess, that way I can excuse all men from having to conform to the stuff I'm talking about, and all women from having to conform to the other side. I just felt like that wasn't going to be enough material for a lecture. Like, if I swirled, men and women in there, it would foster a much more interesting discussion than, because in other words, I do believe that there are, that men adhere to a large extent to the masculine principle, and women adhere to a large extent to the feminine principle. But I don't have the proof. I'm not so utterly drawing the line and convinced of it.
So you're circling the periphery of something that you're trying to get closer to in what you're thinking about and what you're talking about.
I'm trying to make an interesting episode of Unlicensed Psychology. That's my ultimate goal. The goal is to make something interesting, because I don't have any money right now, and I want to get rich. I want to do something that will make me famous, because I'm, you know what I mean? I could say I'm approaching it from a philosophical point of view, but if I had to, I'm going a lot better than a lot of people in saying what my real motivations are, which is to become more of value to people, to get to a point where I can have something to offer, people.
And then that's important. Then it will be of more value, through this discussion of us sharing, and telling you how it's received.
Yeah, this is half the fun. My only fear with this is that only my voice is going to be loud enough to be picked up on the microphone. That's my only that's just this casualty of war. That's just what we have to put up with.
It's interesting that you talk about the practical issues. I mean, what do we substitute? What about the commercial principle as a concept? I mean, because there's a commercial principle at work in which we're all valued and priced and marketed, and it's a principle that I'm trying to join your conceptual framework. It's a principle, the market principle, the commercial principles, in which we all have to define and exploit our individual value in the marketplace is a principle where we all have to categorize ourselves, getting back to
turn it into a product,
naming, categorizing,
marketing and branding.
Yeah, which is in your framework is that male principle at work. You know.
I don't know. Branding. One thing branding does is just says it lets you know what you're getting.
Branding.
Branding. You like this
yeah.
is my brand.
Right. Right.
I feel like they're finding that, like, they started with really simple categories when they started marketing. So, okay, this is an advertisement for women, this is an advertisement for men, and they just, with those broad categories. And now that they can put it into computers, they're getting into more and more and more and more detail, finding that those categories break down even further. So they had those big separations, and now they're finding that it's so much more complicated in a way that starts to bring it together again. Or just admits that when you chop things up that strongly, you get lost in all the details.
I think this. How close are we to the end of this episode? Does anybody? I'm thinking like we're getting almost to the point where no one's going to want to.
I apologize. I know we don't have to.
I'm not sure.
What?
I'm just curious. Like I'm just thinking about that. Like this is the most yin ending possible, yin is like.
Do you want to? I'm sorry.
Thank you for watching this episode, this second episode of Unlicensed Psychology. Join us for the third episode, which will be on the feminine principle.